Hello, and welcome to this Frontiers Forum deep dive session on immune-mediated diseases and climate change. I'm Lee Baker, the Editorial Adviser at Frontiers in Science. A brief word about the journal first. This is our flagship multidisciplinary open access journal focusing on transformational science for healthy lives on a healthy planet. We publish invited, peer-reviewed lead articles within a hub of multi-audience content designed to extend the reach of these articles across science, policy, and the general public. Today's deep dive focuses on this article, titled Immune-mediated disease caused by climate change, associated environmental hazards, mitigation and adaptation. Published in April, the article describes the links between climate change, environmental exposures, and immune dysregulation and the associated diseases, including asthma, allergies, autoimmune disorders, and cancers. It provides a framework of multi-level, multi-sectorial adaptation and mitigation strategies vital to addressing the rising rates of these diseases. Three of the authors, Kari Nadeau, Ioana Agache, and John Balmes, are with us to discuss it today. This is the article hub. It includes editorials by Professor Marsha Wills-Karp from Johns Hopkins and Professor Stephen Holgate, and a viewpoint article by Professor Edward Maibach. Edward and Stephen are both with us here today. It also includes a policy outlook by Frederico Guanais of the OECD. As always with our articles, there's a lay explainer, infographics, a video, and an article in Frontiers for Young Minds, our journal for kids. So here's today's agenda. First of all, we'll hear from two of the authors of the lead article. Professor Kari Nadeau from Harvard University will set the scene. Professor Ioana Agache from the Transilvania University of Brasov in Romania will talk about adapting to and mitigating climate impact on immune health. And then we'll move through a panel discussion, including Professor John Balmes from University of California, San Francisco, and Berkeley, also an article author, together with Professor Sir Stephen Holgate from the University of Southampton, Professor Ed Maibach from George Mason, and Dr John Balbus from the US Department of Health and Human Services in the US. So, let's get us underway. Our first speaker is Kari Nadeau. Kari is the chair of the Department of Environmental Health, and she's John Rock Professor of Climate and Population Studies at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Her research focuses on understanding how environmental and genetic factors affect the risk of developing allergies and asthma, with a particular focus on wildfire-induced air pollution. Among many roles, she serves on the US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA's Children's Health Protection Committee, and the Federal Wildfire Commission. Internationally, she also works with the World Health Organization, for example, on a scoping report on mitigation and adaptation against wildfires. Kari, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. Please get us underway today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see all of the audience from many different countries today. And I want to thank all of the panelists, and they're world-renowned for many of the items that we spoke about in this article, as well as the topics that we'll engage in today in the Q&A session. So I'm also very thankful to the panelists and the Frontiers in Science staff who've made all of this possible today, and my co-authors of the article, John Balmes and Ioana Agache, who are here today. So before we start, again, we really appreciate questions. We'll try to go through these slides so that, most importantly, we can make sure that we have time to answer your questions and to have the panelists discuss some of their expertise in this very important matter that I know we all take seriously, and we want to appreciate how we can affect the future collaboratively and through solutions facing research with policy-oriented outcomes. So this first slide is really important to really look at the overall climate-related issues as they pertain to health outcomes, and the climate-sensitive issues as they pertain to health outcomes. They're listed here, and we speak about this more in detail in the article itself. And importantly is to note that many of us on the planet have already suffered through at least one severe weather condition associated with climate change, and that associates with health changes very dramatically. For example, wildfires or allergens or dust storms that we'll speak about today. There's also other areas in terms of climate change and having climate sensitive health outcomes like injury, heat-related illnesses. Many of our panelists are specialists in these areas, especially with heat stress that we're all dealing with this summer. Waterborne illnesses as well as vector-borne diseases, and importantly, mental health issues. And these health issues are not only important to think about on the acute level, but also on the chronic level. And as they compound over someone's lifetime, looking at the life course effects of climate related exposures as well as environmental exposures in general. The next slide. This article really wanted to focus on the immune system. Our immune system spreads from head to toe. And in our bodies, it's critical for immune responses, not only to vaccines and viruses, as we saw in COVID, but also to maintain health against lung infections or against allergies or immune diseases like autoimmune disease or even cancer. And so when we think about the immune system as it relates to the climate, we need to understand how these exposures of air pollution, extreme heat, extreme weather events, and biodiversity loss will affect our own immune systems on an individual level and on a public level. And the next slide. Oftentimes, we think of the immune system, in my own mind, as a canary in the coal mine. If our immune system isn't working, it's because of a multitude of things. And many of those things pertain to the environment. A lot of the aspects of how well we can have an immune response that's healthy pertains to areas that we can control ourselves or that are environmentally controlled. So inflammatory skin diseases, lung inflammation, asthma, respiratory diseases, as well as immunosuppression, allergic rhinitis or hay fever, eczema or dry skin. We look at other areas of stress that can be related to pregnant women that can lead to premature births, for example. And then important, when we look at the cells themselves, as immunologists, we all look at the mechanism of how cells work. And these types of exposures in the air, like air pollution or what we call particulate matter, 2.5 microns or less that can get into the small airways, they can get absorbed right into our bloodstream and get picked up by immune cells and affect how our cells divide and how our cells function. And the next slide. And so it's important to look at the immune system as a balanced system. And we need that balance in order to have a healthy immune system. And our immune system is critical to our lives. If we're not born with an immune system, we cannot live on this planet. And there are many things that are important to increase in the immune system to provide overall health, like a healthy gut microbiome. Many of us have been learning about what it takes to have a healthy gut microbiome. I talk a lot to my patients about this. I'm a practicing allergy immunologist. And so the gut microbiome is very important to health of the immune system. Exercise is also important, getting enough sleep, having micronutrients and making sure that we take care of ourselves and take care of ourselves as it pertains to a healthy diet. And then importantly, looking at areas in which there could be exposures and our behaviors that could unfortunately decrease how well our immune system works. For example, we spoke about environmental pollution, as well as other aspects of the environment that can worsen our immune system. Stress is part of that, and it reflects many aspects of our lives. Importantly, a westernized dietary pattern, like using foods that unfortunately have a lot of preservatives in them or have a lot of saturated fats, those types of areas that pertain to quote unquote westernized diet are unfortunately not good for our immune system. In addition, obesity and other areas where glucose control is not well studied, both obesity and glucose metabolism diseases can affect the immune system in significant ways to decrease its health and to decrease its ability to function. In the next slide. So we take all of this very seriously because as we look at the overall environment, and I like to call the exposome, these types of parameters, both good and bad, our eating, our diets, our sleep, our ability to be able to have overall health, very much is reflected in how well we take care of our immune system. And our immune system is linked to things like what we call the epithelial barrier, as you see in this slide on the left-hand side. Our skin is everything that touches the air in our body. And so our gut, our lungs, our skin on the outside of our body, these are all important pathways as we discuss further how air pollution, how climate change affects the mechanism of the immune system in our bodies, and not just our bodies as humans, but also animals and to some extent plants and microbes. So you're looking at this wonderful table that was also summarized in the paper that we published in Frontiers in Science. And we actually focus on the molecules that we think are very important as they pertain to overall exposures and how our immune system is affected. And I think that understanding mechanisms is important, looking at how it affects the skin, how it affects different parts of our immunity that we call innate and adaptive immunity. These are very important parts of our immune system as they pertain to how well we respond to vaccines, for example, and viruses and bacteria and fungi. But most importantly, for all of us on this planet, they very much control how well we're going to respond to extreme events that are associated with climate change, like heat waves. When the mechanisms in our body are affected by heat waves, for example, our body cannot compensate enough with its proteins, and we don't have the ability to fold proteins correctly. And so many things go into failure, like our organs. Other aspects of climate change, like dust storms and air pollutants, affect lungs, and we'll talk about that in further slides. Pollen exposure also is rising due to the warming temperatures, and that affects allergies and asthma and immunology. And reduced biodiversity can cause chronic inflammation as well as mental stress. And the next slide. So when we look at the overall aspects of how climate can affect our immune responses, we like to look at both activation and inhibition. Like I said, the immune system is this perfect organism, as it were, that's very balanced. And so if you inhibit the wrong things and you activate the wrong things, you can oftentimes lead to diseases that can be both acute and chronic. And this picture that is shown in this slide is very detailed, but I hope many of you will read the article because the article will go into these mechanisms. And I want you to just look at the overall picture here because it looks like a map and you can see arrows going back and forth. And the reason this is important is because the immune system oftentimes controls itself. But many things that are associated with climate change and the environmental exposures can actually lead to other factors in the immune system that lead to an uncontrolled response. And so things like allergies will cause a lot of problems with people, and those are uncontrolled, whereas other aspects that we need to be controlled actually lack that control and are overinflamed. And so what happens is there's a skewing of the immune system to try to react to things in a maladaptive way, like allergens, and that causes a lot of energy and use of immune cells that could be otherwise fighting infections. And so because of this imbalance that's oftentimes, unfortunately, affected by climate change, we see that many of the immune responses can be maladaptive and unfortunately lead to disease. And the next slide. So let's talk specifically about some of the aspects that unfortunately have led to climate change in and of itself. We are unfortunately causing a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions around our world due to diesel exhaust particles. These are not the only way that one has increase in the global warming of our planet. You'll hear from my colleague that there are other gases that are released into the atmosphere that also lead to global warming. But diesel exhaust particles, transportation, as you see here, are one of the major reasons why we have greenhouse gas emissions and increased global warming. In the next slide. those diesel particles themselves cause inflammation and activation of our immune system. But in addition, when we think about wildfires, wildfires themselves have a lot of smoke associated with them. And this is one of the reasons why much of the world is dealing with air pollution. And wildfires, unfortunately, are not so wild anymore. They often include structures, commercial structures, or residential structures. And so you can imagine paint thinners are going up into the air, your upholstery is going up into the air, detergents are going up into the air. And this is not safe. There's no safe distance from air pollution, and especially as it pertains to air pollution caused by wildfire smoke. And we've seen across health articles and across much research on the epidemiological level, as well as now the detailed blood mechanistic level, that diesel exhaust and wildfire smoke activate the immune system in ways that can cause chronic damage of the lungs, of the skin, as well as our immune system. And the next slide. Why do we care so much about air pollution? Unfortunately, 80% of the world's children are exposed to levels of air pollution greater than the threshold for the World Health Organization. And we think about that and how air pollution is now contributing to not only greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, but also global mortality in and of itself. And you can see this in the map that's projected here. And we need to think about this with the global majority that's presented here and how we can all help each other in solutions around reframing and controlling air pollution. The next slide. And when we look at global mortality and each country that is associated with these changes, we want to make sure that we understand that all of us play a role in this. There are some countries that are more affected by death rates, as you see on the x-axis of this graphic, compared to death rates in the 1990s. And when we think about all of us as contributors, we need to think about how we can best help the low to middle income countries, the people that unfortunately have contributed the least to greenhouse gases, have suffered the most from the effects of global warming and climate change and air pollution. So in looking at how we can best preserve our health and preserve the immune system, as we're talking about today, we need to think about a global way to solve these issues, but also very much on the community and hyper local level that will be important as we think about solving these issues together. And the next slide. And I'd like to talk a little bit about climate change, not only as it pertains to air pollution, wildfire smoke, as well as diesel exhaust, and how the immune system is affected, and how we might be able to change the course of matters around climate solutions. But importantly, as we think about drought conditions and extreme weather conditions, thunderstorm and sandstorms are also increasing. And the reason why this is important to note for our immune system is because oftentimes the sandstorms and dust storms can actually have other toxic microbes in them. For example, the dust storms in Africa oftentimes contain meningococcus, which is associated with meningitis, or the dust storms in the western part of California have coccidiomycosis, which leads to other diseases. And thunderstorms can actually activate pollens in the air and increase asthma. So when we think about these extreme weather conditions associated with climate change, we need to think about all the direct and indirect ways that they affect our bodies, especially as it pertains to how well we're going to have a healthy and both healthy immune system as well as healthy lungs and other aspects of our body. So I'll stop there, and I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Agache. Thank you.
Hi, Kari. Thank you very much. Thanks for setting us up there and for bringing this critical topic to Frontiers in Science. Indeed, our next speaker is Professor Ioana Agache from the Transilvania University of Brasov in Romania. Her research explores asthma phenotypes and endotypes, biomarkers, immune modulation, AI and machine learning approaches, and integrated management of allergic diseases, with a particular focus on exposomics and One Health. She's chaired various guidelines by the European Academy of Allergy and Clinical Immunology, EACI, including those on allergic asthma, on biologics, on immunotherapy, and on environmental science. So, welcome, Ioana. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the colleagues for attending and organizing this exciting discussion forum that I hope that will advance the field forward, because we need to keep building this community and, providing support to our human health in relation with the environmental health. So what I would like to touch briefly upon, which is also part of our paper, and it's very important, is the concept that human health is very much related to environmental health. And one of the uh, key points in defining environmental health is biodiversity, and we know that it is very important for maintaining the proper function of the immune system. Furthermore, I think that when we think about how our body is adapting, we have to understand that the main driver of adaptation is our healthy immune system. And there are three important key pillars that keep the immune system in place. One is the microbiome, which is very much dependent on the biodiversity and the environmental health. Then there is the epithelial barrier, as Kari described previously, and the health of the epithelial barrier is also very important. And the third key pillar is diet. Now, the immune system adapts and helps you keep your health. And this is called resilience. Resilience is a very important fixing process, reparatory process. It keeps you healthy, but not, indefinitely if you keep having the aggression there. And you should also take into account that the correction process that is called allostasis is also damaging in the long term. And we can see that, for example, you fix the acute environmental stressor at that time, but in the long run, there are some modifications that are passed over generations. So with these epigenetic changes that we have, we also impact future generations that are coming. So this is a very important thing that you have to have in mind when you also try to fix the aggression. Now, of course, besides loss of biodiversity, in connection with that, we are going through lifestyle changes, which are very important, with urbanization, big migration to the cities, with improved hygiene standards, westernized diet, unnecessary antibiotic use, so on and so forth. All of these, they create an important network that we called an exposome. And this exposome is extremely important because it creates different ways of aggression towards health, and it's very difficult to evaluate its impact on the immune system. Now, in terms of diet, that is also important. It's not only obesity that you see there on the slide, but it's also undernutrition and malnutrition that is there. And this is also having its heavy toll on the impact of the immune system. Now, we would like to discuss with you today several adaptation and mitigation strategies, like to slow the impact of climate change on the human health, like, for example, reducing greenhouse emissions, improving air quality, increasing biodiversity. Also, looking at providing safe houses and reducing vulnerability to climate change impact. For that, we need three important things that we need to understand. First of all, is that we have to first start with our healthcare professionals and patients and do a lot of education there on counseling on resilience, on the concept of resilience, on avoidance on environmental stress, on how we implement the precepts of environmental health in daily routine. We have to advise this to our patients and also teach our patients and our colleagues to do a lot of advocacy around the impact of climate change. And our latest guidelines that we published on the impact of outdoor pollution through the European Academy of Allergy and Clinical Immunology actually provide some counseling on that side. Now, the second thing is that we need to fully understand the concept of exposomics, which is an advanced methodological approach. It is advantageous because it provides you a risk profile instead of single association, and you can prove causality instead of association. And in the science of exposomic, we use a combination between artificial intelligence models and biomarkers that are related to various exposures. Why is this important? Because we need to implement multifaceted environmental interventions, like doing at the same time, building on the resilience, decreasing the aggression from the environment. So restoring all the balance that is necessary to keep life. Last but not least, we need to work more on the concept of One Health, because this is extremely important. And I was very happy to see that the last resolution of the European Council that was published yesterday is focusing on linking the human health to the environmental health, and is especially promoting the One Health policies interventions, which should prioritize as well solutions for the impact of sustainable health strategies, to promote balanced use of resources, and also to prioritize solutions for the impact of poverty, migration, overpopulation, and inequity. And with that, I would like to close and thank you so much for allowing us to present this paper, and of course, looking forward to the discussions that we are going to have. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Ioana, and to Kari for setting the scene of the Frontiers in Science article. We're now going to discuss some of the issues raised with the panel, but do keep your audience, your questions coming in. We already have many questions, and we'll be getting to as many of those as we can shortly, so do keep them coming in. Meanwhile, I shall introduce our new additional guest panelists. First of all, we have John Balmes, Professor John Balmes, the University of California, San Francisco, and Berkeley. John's one of the co-authors. His research is dedicated to the respiratory, cardiovascular, and metabolic health effects of various air pollutants and occupational agents. Among many projects, he collaborates on various epidemiological studies, including the Children's Health and Air Pollution Study, and he serves on various government bodies, including the California Air Resources Board. He also collaborates on studies of the effects of smoke exposure on populations in various other countries, including Guatemala, Malawi, Rwanda, and Nepal. Welcome to John, and also to Professor Sir Stephen Holgate. Stephen is MRC Professor of Immunopharmacology at the University of Southampton's Faculty of Medicine. He authored the editorial that complements the lead article on our article hub. As well as his pioneering research to elucidate the pathogenesis of asthma throughout the life course and the effects of air pollution, Stephen has led various organizations to promote lung health and has chaired various committees to influence government policy. In 2020, he received a knighthood for his services to medical research. Edward Maibach is Distinguished University Professor and Director of the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. His research centers on understanding and promoting public engagement in climate change. He's a principal investigator of climate change in the American Mind, a poll, and he co-developed the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, an educational initiative that currently involves 52 national medical societies. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. John Balbus, Director of the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity at the US Department of Health and Human Services. He's a physician and public health professional, specializing in health implications of climate change and building healthy, resilient communities and environments. He served on various roles, including principal to the US Global Change Research Program, co-chair of the Working Group on Climate Change and Human Health for the US Global Change Research Program, and senior public health advisor to the director of the National Institute of Environmental Sciences. So, welcome everybody to the discussion today. A quick question, first of all, to our panelists. And first of all, John Balmes, if I can turn to you. In the presentations just now, there was a strong focus on air pollution as a leading cause of death, and with a particular focus on outdoor air pollution. But we also know that indoor air pollution also has a strong contribution to the disease burden. Could you give us an outline of this and sort of latest approaches? We're aware that the ATS has recently published a workshop report on this, and I know you're involved in various initiatives. So indoor air pollution, John, if you would.
Thank you, Lee. And thank you to Kari and Ioana for starting us off with a very nice summary of our review paper. So I'll start off with exposures in terms of climate change. And anything that is a carbon-based fuel that is combusted in our atmosphere generates CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, but also oxides of nitrogen, which have both climate forcing properties and adverse health impacts. And we generate a fair amount of oxides of nitrogen from gas appliances, natural gas or methane fueled appliances in our homes, in our buildings. So there's been a lot of concern and some research to support that concern, especially about children with asthma and exposure to natural gas cooking, which is very popular in the US and I think in many other developed countries. And in low and middle income countries, there's an increasing push to use propane, which is another gas that can generate, especially when it's burned indoors, oxides of nitrogen that can harm children's health. So there's a climate change mitigation benefit to getting rid of natural gas appliances, and that would include furnaces for heating, hot water from water heaters, as well as cooking with gas. And in California, where I'm from, there's been a big push to electrify cooking. California has currently a large percentage of homes with natural gas cooking, and we're trying to get individuals to voluntarily move to electric cooking, especially induction cooking, which is more efficient than conventional resistance electric cooking. But this is all voluntary. There's no regulation in place in California. There's been talk of a US regulation that caused a lot of consternation on the part of many politicians. So I don't think anyone is going towards forcing people to cook with electricity, but it would be a good thing for the climate. And there would be a co-benefit for people with pre-existing respiratory disease, especially kids with asthma. And I'll just end on saying that I'm funded by the California Energy Commission, funded with colleagues, to study whether changing cooking in low-income households with a child with asthma, whether replacing their gas stoves with electric induction stoves will improve the child's asthma. And we were funded by the California Energy Commission because they want to get away from natural gas combustion in homes, especially with cooking. But they think it would, if we can show an asthma effect, that we can improve childhood asthma by electrification of cooking, that would sort of push people to for that transformation. And I think it's probably correct. So we're doing a randomized controlled trial. We just started, so I won't have results for a year or two, but I think it's what's needed to show that electrification of cooking will really make a difference.
Right. We might get to the research needs later on. I know the article touches on the importance of, what research is necessary to demonstrate, to have the evidence base, if you like, to influence, to drive policy change. And I think we might come back to that later. Thanks. Thanks, John. Stephen, over to Stephen. First of all, Stephen Holgate's sitting in the UK. Happy Clean Air Day.
Thank you.
And you kindly contributed the editorial, one of the two editorials to the hub on this topic, and you touch in that in part on particularly early life influences and emerging evidence of epigenetics, trained immunity, and its relationship to, I guess, environmental exposures over time and the associated diseases. Could you touch on the latest thinking there? Where are we at with that, and how has this evidence base developed just in recent years?
Yes, thank you, Lee, and thank you for organising with all your wonderful colleagues at Frontiers this great conference and the wonderful review that Kari and Ioana have marshalled with John. It's a superb article. I'm recommending it to everybody to read if you haven't already read it. Now, I wrote an editorial to make 2 points, really. The first, I illustrated three real people who were suffering the effects of these immune-mediated and non-communicable diseases. And the important thing about this is that they all started their origins in children. And I think the debate really about what it is in the environment that's accounting for the tremendous increase in these non-communicable diseases, including allergy and asthma, of course, but also rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory bowel disease, diabetes, etc., etc. It's the fact that the programming probably starts very early on in life. We now know, for example, that particulate air pollutants can travel into the mother's circulation and then get trapped in the placenta, but more than that, go across the placenta and into the fetal circulation and embed themselves in the fetal developing organs. And of course, these particles are like Trojan horses. They're carrying in chemicals on their surface and in their centers that are slowly released in the tissues and set up various pathways. And one of the important ones that's come to light recently, as you pointed out, is this very interesting aspect of what's called trained immunity. And this is where the innate immune system, that's not the adaptive immune system, it's the innate immune system, which involves constitutive cells, including epithelial cells, but macrophages and monocytes and some stem cells. The metabolic programming of those cells, such that they start to change their direction of travel. And you heard during this wonderful presentation a few minutes ago how the immune system becomes unbalanced. And this unbalanced state of the immune system possibly even starts in the uterus, but certainly continues once the child is born for the first 3 years of life at least. And it's when the baby comes into contact then with environmental microbes, which have been altered in the environment they're now being delivered into compared to many hundreds of years ago, that the immune system gets confused and starts to move in the direction, in our case, towards asthma and allergy, but in the case of rheumatoid arthritis, obviously the opposite side of the immune response in the joints. And it's this plastic immunity, of course, which is so operative in early life, where the opportunity for intervening looks very exciting, either metabolically through the diet, and there's a lot of experiments now going on of dietary programming early in life to see if we can switch off some of these pathways, but also using various stimuli that one can give, like adjuvants in giving a vaccine to enhance the vaccine's therapeutic effect, giving some sort of adjuvant to these young children that augments the immune response, but this time in the right direction, but not in the wrong direction.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for that overview. I'm going to turn to John Balbus. John, Kari touched on heat, extreme heat events in the presentation, and there has been mounting research and experience over the last few years of the impact of heat. From your perspective, how are the relevant actors responding in the US to this rising risk from extreme heat-related disease?
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, important question. I also just want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody on the call. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to the organizers of this great webinar. The presentations so far have been really stimulating, and the topic is really important. Heat is a very serious issue right now where I sit in Washington, D.C. as we go into unprecedented June heat. In the United States, we've seen an alarming increase in the number of people dying from heat every year. Between, in the first 2 decades of this century, the average number of deaths reported was about 700 per year. In the last 3 years, that's gone up to 1,100 to 1,800 and now to 2,300 deaths estimated last year. So nearly a tripling from where we were. And that's very clearly associated with really devastating heat waves that are starting to cross these thresholds. The key thing about heat is that it is 100% preventable, but it's mostly preventable by interventions in the social realm or in the built environment realm or in the energy realm. So there has been a lot of activity in the federal government to organize across all these different sectors. First of all, we have enhanced early warning systems, and just this last March, the US produced something that France and several other countries already have, which is a health-based trigger for alerting people for heat waves that also is more than just on-off, not just a bad heat day, not a bad heat day, but has gradations of severity. It's called heat risk. It's based on epidemiology in about 210 different parts of the United States. It's a big country, so we need that kind of local data. And it lets people know, what temperatures does that area see upticks in mortality, at 4 levels of severity. We're seeing a lot more activity to enhance the response to heat. Areas of the United States like Maricopa County, Arizona, that experienced almost over 600 deaths last year, are learning how to better cope with the problem. In Maricopa County especially, vast majority of people who have succumbed have had issues with either homelessness or substance abuse, which makes them, people with those problems are harder to reach, harder to engage in the system, harder to affect. So there's a lot of effort underway to improve the cooling centers, the training of the staff, to help people experiencing homelessness, to have them, allow them to bring their pets so they'll come in. All different kinds of ways to try to really help those populations. And then there's a lot of funding and a lot of money going into enhanced mitigation of the environment. This ranges from acute responses, such as some of the social services in the United States. The Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program is increasingly being used to provide cooling assistance. It was created to keep people's heat on in the winter, but now it's providing emergency and non-emergency cooling. Our Medicaid program issues waivers so that doctors can write prescriptions for air conditioners and air filters when there's wildfire smoke, and to be able to use health funding to provide life-saving air conditioning, life-saving air filtration. And then under the Biden administration, we've passed major legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, that are literally putting billions of dollars into things like tree planting, into cool surfaces, into cool roofs and cool streets, and into home weatherization. There's multiple ways that that's going on, because ultimately we have to provide everybody with an indoor environment. As we get to this threshold in so many parts of the world, and what we're seeing in Southwest United States, where the outdoor environment is becoming uninhabitable, we have to be able to provide everybody with a safe indoor environment. And then lastly, there are regulations underway. I mean, California's leading the way, but we're working at a national level for regulation for at least worker protection, and a lot of areas are doing indoor air regulations as well for landlords. So that's a smattering.
Yeah, thanks for that summary, John. I know there's clearly an awful lot going on, and perhaps we'll have other policy responses brought up when we get to the audience Q&A. Do keep your questions coming. Thanks, John. Lastly, over to Professor Edward Maibach at George Mason. Ed, your center's involved in the Climate Change and American Mind poll, which I mentioned at the top. Can you give us a sense of what that work's doing? And perhaps more importantly, what's it telling us about the public's concerns, the public's responses to these the disease burden, if you like, from climate change and climate change itself, and how does it compare internationally?
Yeah, thank you, Lee. There is a rapidly rising concern among members of the public, excuse me, in the US and in countries around the world about climate change. And that's very much consistent with the realities that we face in climate change. So the public is rapidly coming to be aware of it, to be concerned about it, and to support appropriate policy responses. So just yesterday, for example, the United Nations released a poll conducted in, I believe, 77 countries, about 1,000 people in each of those countries, and the results were pretty remarkable in terms of showing widespread public support for rapidly accelerating the transition away from fossil fuels and towards a clean energy economy. So, I interpret all of that fundamentally as good news. The public is rapidly waking up to the risks that we are facing. But the point I want to leave to introduce into the conversation now is that rising public concern is almost without an understanding of the reason we're gathered here today, talking about the human health impacts of climate change. My research team last November, in conjunction with the COP28, we conducted a worldwide literature review, looking at what the public in countries around the world understood about the human health relevance of climate change. The literature is relatively thin. Much of it is conducted in English-speaking countries. But regardless, what literature is out there shows pretty clearly that most members of the public know very little, if anything, about the human health relevance of climate change. So this rising climate concern is happening in the context of, I'll say, lack of awareness or ignorance of the realities of the profound human health impacts of climate change. Another thing that we learned in reviewing that literature and releasing it last November was that research where researchers have made an effort to help people understand those facts, the facts that we're talking about here today, and a more broad set of facts about the human health relevance of climate change and the human health benefits of climate solutions, it shows that is fundamentally a highly engaging additional set of information that we can provide. So the implication for those of us on the panel today, the implication probably for most of the people who are joining us in this conversation today, many of whom are likely health professionals, is that we have a really important opportunity right at hand. And that opportunity is to really work hard at sharing what we know based on medical science and public health science about the human health relevance of climate change, because it will likely accelerate this rapidly growing societal consensus that we need to rapidly pivot away from fossil fuels and towards a clean energy economy.
Just while we're on the point, John, I believe you've been involved with, Ed, sorry, we've been involved with the WHO on a toolkit toward this purpose, right, to help health professionals and the organizational network that you support as well, to bring health professionals to the fore, if you like, to advocate about the health impacts of climate change. While we're on this topic, could you just explain what those initiatives are doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's building off what I said a moment ago. If we have an important opportunity to help not only the public, but frankly, our policymakers, our elected leaders and government officials better understand the realities of the health relevance of climate change and the health benefits of climate solutions, we need to use our trusted voices to do that educational work. My team has also surveyed health professionals around the world over the past 5 or so years. And we've learned that most health professionals understand this problem. They're concerned about the problem. They would like to see the health community writ large get involved in doing exactly that education of the public and of policymakers. But, and this is an important but, they feel while they're convinced of the importance of doing so, they feel themselves that they need additional education. They need education about the details, the kind of information that Ioana and Kari reviewed and John reviewed in this paper. And they need a little coaching on how best to explain the human health relevance to the public and to policymakers. And that's what the World Health Organization, in partnership with the Global Climate and Health Alliance and the Canadian Medical Association and Health Canada, that's why we developed the toolkit for communicating about the health relevance of climate change. I don't remember the exact month it was released, but it was released earlier this year. It's a terrific toolkit. I say that with the disclosure that I was a consultant to the project. That notwithstanding, it's a really useful tool to help health professionals understand exactly what the research-based evidence is about how to communicate these health risks and these health benefits successfully.
Right. Just to let our audience know, the Ed's Viewpoint article in the Frontiers in Science Hub does touch on this, and there's a reference and a link to the toolkit there. So please do go and check out that toolkit, and you can see what Ed is explaining there. Thank you very much, Ed. Now we're going to take audience questions. So please keep your questions coming in. We have many already, but we're looking forward to answering as many as we can. And maybe, Kari, if I can loop back to you and Ioana, several questions have come in with respect to various aspects of the variation in the effect of climate change on environmental exposures and thus disease internationally. And for example, a question from Peter Lefseuf points out that data on the increase in asthma in adults is not uniform. And in some areas, perhaps even in the US, some data shows a decrease, whereas in other areas of the world, there's an increase in asthma incidence. So could you perhaps just dig in a little bit on that international variation and what we know about it, and perhaps toward how can those data and those variations help in interventions that are common between countries, i.e. where there are common patterns,
Yes,
that inform common solutions? I suppose that's also speaking to other questions as well.
absolutely. That's an excellent question, and I've been reading the Q&A, so I thank the audience for such excellent catalytic questions that really help us and help all the world around how we can harmonize this research and collaborate together better. And as we think about a lot of the panelists and our discussions, as well as what we wrote in the article, a lot of what we're doing right now in terms of climate change and understanding how climate change affects health directly is to measure, monitor, and manage. And in that measuring, monitoring, and managing, we need to measure things that we can. Now, oftentimes around the globe, sometimes the way we monitor air pollution is not always the same from country to country. Some countries might have resources that enable them to have good air pollution monitoring, others don't. And so when we think about the articles that may come out for to what degree air pollution or heat waves are associated with asthma, we really need to, like this seminar and webinar is all about, take a deeper dive and to look at what people used for the definition of asthma, what people used for the exposure analysis, how did they do that study to look at the association. I can say that many evidence pieces are available, that the arc of evidence from things that we call meta-analyses, that I know a lot of you know as audience participants, as scientists, that when we look at the overall meta-analysis of the weight of data from many different articles that are independently run from around the world, that there is clear evidence showing that heat waves are associated with asthma increases, that air pollution is not only associated with worsening of asthma, but also inducing asthma. And so a lot of the panelists here have been part of that work. I'll let them answer these questions as well. But I think to the point of the question by the person, it also lets us think about how do we better harmonize data? How do we better harmonize how we measure, how we monitor, and how we manage? And that's why I'm really grateful for Dr. John Balbus and Dr. Ed Maibach for being part of this discussion, because a lot of what they're doing is bringing science to policy. How do we make sure that we have solutions-facing research that's policy-oriented towards that very aspect of how do we manage each other's health, and not just for solutions, but also for getting ahead of the game so that we can prevent worsening of disease due to climate change. So I'll stop there and see if other panelists would like to contribute to the answer. Thank you.
Just to add on what Kari was mentioning, I appreciate the idea of harmonization, which is very, very important so that we can speak the same language. And, you know, these deep dive sessions is very helpful in aligning ourselves with, in terms of how we define outcomes and prove causality, which is very important. But I would also like to bring the other angle here, that we also have to individualize interventions into what is possible to be done in each country, for example, or in an individual or in a particular setting. So preventive measures and adaptation and mitigation measures will not be an overall, you know, thing that we can apply everywhere. We have to adapt locally and adapt to the resources that we have in order to be successful. So again, particular scenarios might apply to different sides of the globe, and I think that keeping this diversity is also very important. So harmonize, but also diversify at the same time.
We had another question. Oh, sorry, Stephen, please go ahead.
Well, I was only just going to come in really to bring in another part of the article that you wrote, and this is the importance of the barrier function that you mentioned, Ioana, in your presentation. And this is a relatively new area where we're understanding how the epithelial interface between the external world and the internal organs and tissues interact. And most of the interesting genes that have emerged in the sort of genome-wide association studies are preferentially expressed in these superficial structures to indicate that the gene bioenvironmental interaction, which might not be direct, it could involve microbes and the chemicals that microbes make in the microbiome, in the gut and in the lung, that they're really important in setting the scene in the way this immune response differentiates over time. And I think in different racial groups and in different parts of the world, this aspect probably varies quite a lot, because certainly in the Western part of the world, many of those genes have ancestors in the Neanderthal genetic makeup. And that in those days, which of course is a very long time ago, they were probably creating a protective function for the environment that those peoples were living in. But of course, our environments changed and changed hugely. And those genes that might have been protective then are now turning their attack on us directly. And I think it's this changing environment that we really need to concentrate on, because that's the thing we can do most about.
Right. What about real-time monitoring? Kari, you mentioned the measuring monitoring aspect there, but one of our questions from Olga Kupika, sorry, beg your pardon, for Eric Uram. Given the variations, and also speaking to Ioana, your point, given the variations between individuals in their responsiveness to variable changes in allergen exposures and levels, that suggests that real-time monitoring ideally would be better able to forewarn people of the state of play in their locality. What's the state of the implementation of real-time monitoring and communication of data that could benefit people?
Yeah, I could comment a little bit, but I also like to make sure that I pass this baton to John Balmes and John Balbus. I think that it's important to look at things that they are not mutually exclusive. We can monitor both on the individual level and the public level. Both are important, but I want to make sure that we focus on those communities that are unfortunately already inequitably exposed. We have many communities that don't have the resources necessarily to be able to have individual monitors or to be able to have both indoor or outdoor air pollution monitors or filters or masks. And so we need to, as a society and as a public health officers, also think about ways to help those groups like John Balbus had mentioned with some of the changes that are going on in the US, for example. But in that, there are many personal monitors that one can get. And I would say buyer beware. Make sure that you know that they have good quality and that they've been tested and that they can help make change so that if you're going to buy these personal monitors, that you know how to use them and that you know what you can do with them and how you might change your own lives because of them. I hope that we can crowdsource a lot of this data and that we can have personal sensing monitors that are low cost for the world. But I know that that's a hope, and that I hope we can deliver on that through the promise of our research and through our promise of shared resources. But I also think that we need to also think about how to monitor from a public health level. And that's where I'd love John Balbus to comment on the heat indices, because we're monitoring, for example, for wildfires. And now that that can go out on public broadcasting, thanks to a lot of people working together, so that public communities know about a wildfire before it might get to their community through now, thankfully, smartphones or alert systems. Same thing for heat waves. So I think these types of monitoring systems for the public are really important that governments are doing to help prevent worsening of a climate change health outcome. But I'll stop there and see what John and John Balbus think. And please, I welcome others as well, Stephen
Thank you,
and
Kari.
Ed and Ioana.
Thank you, Kari. I think I'll jump in before John Balbus talks about governmental responses. So, there's two kinds of monitoring that we should distinguish here. And there's now an array of low-cost sensing devices for particulate matter, for fine particulate matter. And some of them are pretty good. And they're reasonably priced so that they're more available potentially to lower income communities. That said, there was a study of wildfire smoke penetration into homes in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm from, that showed that the concentration of a certain type of low-cost monitor, the purple air, which is the most widely used one. It's not the only one that's good. I'm not trying to sell purple airs here, but they have a wide dispersion around the world, actually. But in the Bay Area, they were mostly found in wealthy neighborhoods. Even though they're $200, now a poor family, even in the US, is not going to be able to necessarily shell out $200 for such a low-cost monitor, but they could be put into communities to give that local neighborhood a warning about how bad the air quality is from the wildfires. And currently in Northern California, where again I'm from, there are at least 3 major wildfires that are fouling the air. So it's an important way to become aware at the neighborhood level of how bad the air quality is. The US EPA, in its air quality index warning system, you can go online and find out your air quality index for your area. But there's also now a domain for fire and smoke that uses those purple air data to give more finely resolved information. And in parts of Africa where I work, purple airs are the only, or purple airs and other similar low-cost sensing devices are the only ones that are available because there's no governmental monitoring. So I think we can do, I mean, the technology is now available. We need to make it more widely accessible by low-income folks. And then on the asthma side, there are now ways to monitor where individuals are experiencing asthma exacerbations related to air pollution or any other environmental exposure, because you have metered dose inhalers that have geographic information system connections, so that you can whenever you activate your metered dose inhaler, you are triggering into the cloud that location of where it was activated. And that's been used widely in research now. I participated in several papers where we use that, but that technology is available for, again, people that can afford it. It's not going to be able to be used in low-income settings at this point, but those GPS-enabled asthma medications, I think that has promise for people learning what environments actually trigger their asthma.
Right. Thanks, John. John,
I'll jump in with, I just want to add 3 points to the wonderful things that John and Kari have said. First thing is, I think we are on the verge of a revolution in terms of personal monitoring, in terms of personal health monitoring. The conjunction of the electronic devices we wear and artificial intelligence are going to be really changing the feedback we get on our body's homeostasis. Again, this is for people who can afford these devices. This is definitely a wealthy population opportunity. But I just want to make the broader point that, so often, whether it's, even addressing health equity or, precision medicine or the use of artificial intelligence, we still haven't gotten these climate change and environmental issues mainstreamed into the thinking of the people who are developing them. I think it's starting to change. We're really trying to change that within HHS, but just as a very big point, the health field moves around and it's moving very rapidly and changing very rapidly with artificial intelligence and telehealth and all kinds of application of technology. And very rarely, and it has huge implications for the carbon footprint of the practice of medicine. It has huge implications for the ability to protect people from climate change related health effects. But very often those things aren't thought about. The second thing is that as the point we're making, monitoring is important, but so many populations, are in need of more than just that information. They get the information. What are they going to do to respond? And I would just submit that, having monitors everywhere in the world is probably not as important as assuring that we have good passive protection, that we have higher quality housing, that we have, passive cooling, that we have, the ability to so that people don't have to, what do they do if you're in a deprived situation and you get a warning that there's heat, if you don't have air conditioning, if you don't have a filter, if you don't have a car, if you don't have all these things. Much better that we really focus on, the primary prevention and the passive protection. I mean, the last thing I'll say is, the more information that we generate, it's information, right? And we know that we have problems with information in our modern society. We have a lot of problems with disinformation and counter-information, so messages going out saying that, that's not important, that's not real, or just the challenge we will have here of either information getting more complex. So it's good to have 4 levels of heat response, but it's also more complex. People may not understand it as well. Or if we have heat alerts every week, we have the issue of fatigue. And of course, my colleague Ed Maibach is the world's expert on these kind of issues, that the more information we generate about everything, it doesn't necessarily translate, it has to be we have to be thoughtful in how do we translate that into the most effective protection and responses.
Right. Ed, could I ask you to pick up on that? How do you think communication modalities will need to evolve to handle the complexity of the information, to make sure that information that's increasingly generated actually benefits people, reaches the right people, or let's say the people who need it, and benefits them.
Yeah, well, I fully agree with my friend and colleague John Balbus that there are limits to information, and no matter how hard we try to get the information right, there will always be a vigorous effort, or many vigorous efforts, to confuse us, to introduce misinformation in, to stop us, by us I mean collectively society, from making smart decisions that will move us away from a fossil fuel economy. But that notwithstanding, we do know, I've been in the public health communication business for 43 years now. And there's one thing I have learned in that period of time with greater confidence than anything else, and that is when it's important for us to share information that's based in science, in evidence, there's an evidence-based formula to do so successfully. And that evidence-based formula is we need to have simple, clear messages. It's not necessarily easy to do because much of the information we're trying to share is complicated by its very nature. But if we want to be successful in sharing it, we have to create simple, clear messages. So that's the first component, simple, clear messages. The second component, Lee, as you suggested, is message repetition. So those simple, clear messages have to be repeated often, over and over and over again. And the nature of experts and expertise is we get bored very quickly by repeating ourselves. And that's a perfectly understandable. When you become an expert in something, you should do what you do best. You don't necessarily have to be the communicator, but for those of us who want to ensure the effectiveness of the communication, we absolutely must ensure that our messages, the simple, clear messages, are being repeated with sufficient repetition that people will eventually begin to learn them, think about them, incorporate them into their understanding of the world, and make better decisions as a result of it. And then the third and final component, simple, clear messages repeated often. The third and the most final component is the most important, through trusted and caring voices. Because when there is no trust in the messenger, people will quickly stop paying attention, or even more quickly begin to counter-argue, and thus neutralizing any potential benefit of sharing the information. So John Balbus's point about the rapidly evolving information environment enabled and abetted by technology, absolutely true. But still, our best means of sharing what we know to be true and fighting misinformation is through simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted and caring voices. And we, my friends, we in the health professions, are the most trusted and seen to be the most caring voices in countries around the world.
Okay, wonderfully communicated, Ed, if I may. Yourself, that's a great, very, very strong summary of the needs there. Looping back to some of one of our comments, one of our questions, I should say, and everyone do keep them coming in. We'll handle as many as we can. Looping back to perhaps primary prevention that John Balbus mentioned, and I think Kari, speaking to an interest of yours, I'm going to read this question. Given this is from Carol Callens, given their substantial environmental impact, including contribution to global greenhouse gases, to extensive energy consumption, deforestation, and various forms of pollution, which we're speaking about today, should agri-food systems receive a greater focus in this setting? So far, we've spoken a lot about the air pollution itself. Kari, I know you're interested also in food allergies too, I believe. So, and it's touched on the article. Could we touch briefly on the role of food in and the exposures therein from that system, if you like, on the topic of immune-mediated diseases?
Sure, I think that's wonderful. I think we'll have to do many, many more review articles for Frontiers in Science, because this is also a very important topic. And I think a lot of us on this panel, as well as my fellow authors, thought deeply about the immune system and how it responds to food. And if food is, of course, supposed to be a nutritious source for which we can make good choices. And there are some comments that I've been reading in the chat, as well as the Q&A, about the fact that, of course, food is a source also of some bad chemicals too that can be toxic to our immune system. And so we have to balance that and know what could be contained in the food or not. But as it pertains to food as a nexus point by which to think about how to better improve planetary health as well as individual health, food is kind of this reflection of agricultural systems, which also increase greenhouse gases. It's also a reflection of resource constrainment in terms of communities that might not have resources or the ability to get the right food when they need it. I have to say that while we've been over the last year getting ministers of health together throughout the world, ministers of the environment, ministers of finance, we had a convening at the Academy of Athens to be able to improve agricultural systems. And that's so important because it also will potentially reduce water usage, reduce the usage of land that could be used for other resources and carbon sequestration, for example. So in all of these discussions, we have thought about food and to reduce the use of preservatives, like we said, that could be harmful to the immune system, like emulsifiers, and to other chemicals that are actually harmful to the immune system that could cause cancer. So all of these things have to be looked at more carefully. But importantly, today we're talking about the immune system. Food plays a role of that in an important way with that whole concept of exposomics, both good food and microbiome, like Dr. Holgate mentioned, with food that could actually help our microbiome, food that can help vitamins, help protect our immune system, but also food systems that can cause allergies, for example. But what we have found, which might be interesting to the audience, is that plant-based diets do not increase food allergies, and that what's important is to think about new agricultural systems that can improve the planetary health, as well as create better ways for us to get nutrition across the world. I've been very impressed with communities that are going to their own native plants and using resilient species for example, that actually are resilient to drought or heat. So I think we're going to be working much more with traditional ecology to understand this better. Finally, there are a lot of people that are in the production of food, and occupational health workers also are very important to all of us as we think about those that are inequitably exposed. So people that farm, people that are taking care of animals, for example, they're also exposed to a lot of heat and can be outside for long periods of time, like, for example, those that harvest grapes. So we think about all of these aspects of climate change as it pertains to food as a nexus point for dealing with a lot of the issues we've talked about today. I hope that's helpful.
Right.
Could I jump in with something, Lee?
John,
Yeah.
I was about to come to you. I thought you might, and I know you work in the sphere too. We've probably got about 10 minutes. We're going to take a couple more, but please,
I'll
John,
be very
do
quick.
elaborate. Of course, please do
I
elaborate.
totally agree with what Kari said, but it's just important to emphasize the westernization of agriculture and the westernization of diets that has been mentioned produces a huge amount of methane. Animal husbandry, especially beef, cattle production, generates a lot of methane, which is, a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 by at least 21 times. And dairy production is increasingly in large dairies around the world, especially in the US, that also generate a lot of methane. So I like to say, in addition to clean transportation and clean power generation, we need cleaner food production.
Right. Just to let everybody know, there is shortly one of the next publications at Frontiers in Science is the methane imperative, an analysis of methane increases around the world and how to address those. So please, if that's your field, please do stay tuned. I think last sort of 10 minutes or so, a few questions if we can, and some of these are complex questions to ask for quick responses, but hey, that's my prerogative. Fatima Laka asks, and I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit, in your research and experience, what are some unique health challenges related to climate change and, let's say, immune health in this setting faced by populations in the global south as compared with the global north? Considering the disparities in the resources and infrastructures, what approaches do you believe are the most effective in building resilience and adaptive capacities to these risks in the global south? Maybe, John, maybe you could stay on for a minute and just give the first response, and then we'll broaden that out, because I know you do research elsewhere in the world and collaborations.
Were you directing that to me?
I think, John, if you could, seeing as you're on right now, if you could maybe just first start off and then we'll broaden it around. But I know you do work in various communities around the world that might shed light on this.
And, I was responding to a question in the chat. The specific question you're asking me to deal with is?
Yeah, with respect to the differentiating the risks and
okay, yes.
between
So many,
the
yeah. Sorry, Lee. Thank you. 40% of the world's population still cooks with solid fuel. In India, that's dried dung. In Guatemala, it's wood. In Malawi, where I've worked, it's dried maize cobs, corn cobs. And, that produces particles that are actually carbon particles that are climate forcing, and they're bad for health. So it would be nice to electrify cooking in all those, especially in rural areas of low-income countries, but the electricity isn't there. And if it is there, like in India, it's it's from coal-fired power plants, even though India is trying to increase solar and wind generation. So I'd say that even though I was sort of talking against gas for cooking, LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, is actually a cleaner option than burning solid fuels. And it's better for both the climate and for health. So, I really go back to what Kari said. The countries that have produced the most greenhouse gas emissions have the wealth to help the countries that haven't produced greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there should be a major transfer of economic support from those wealthy countries, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, to countries in the Southern Hemisphere who have experience the differential health impacts, but also don't have the resources to deal with.
Right. Ioana, I think you might have had your hand up. Was it to take on this point as well? Thanks, John.
Not on this one, on the previous one, on the plants. I think that we are missing one important point when we are talking about this plant-based diets, and because we have to integrate this with planetary health concept and environmental health. Remember that heat stress also is important in plants and is modifying the composition of the plants and of the diets that we are having. So what we consider, let's say, a healthy plant is not always a healthy plant because it's also severely stressed by the environment. So when we tackle this, we have to tackle it globally together with our colleagues, looking at in the botanical science and also in veterinary science, and look all together on the impact of climate change on all these ecosystems, because it's not only the humans, but also all around us, which might be damaged by the environmental stressors. This is what I wanted to point, because I think it's very, very important that we work all together in a holistic approach.
Right. Stephen, just last few closing comments from everyone. In your editorial, you wrote quite movingly about some examples of people in vulnerable situations within countries, even within the UK. Could you speak to that briefly on the need for that specific attention between populations, even within countries, as well as between countries?
Well, I think we often rely on scientific approaches to answering these complex questions. And in that, of course, one generates masses of data. And we've just discussed that earlier on. But there's another way of getting messages through to politicians and to the public. And that's through case studies, where they can identify with individual human beings who in their own life journey have gone through an experience where you can trace back the importance of climate change influencing what's happened to them. And I think we as physicians and health messengers probably ought to use storytelling more than we currently do to try and get our so-called simple messages across, because the average person in the street understands stories, but they don't understand statistics or large sets of numbers. So I think, this is a part of communication that I think we need help with from our social scientists friends and from the arts and humanities to help us translate what are often complex messages into these case stories where people can identify with them, as I did in that editorial with those 3 children who lost their lives. And the other thing I just wanted to say, Lee, is that although those 3 children lost their lives, very sadly, because of the different circumstances that I explained, what their parents have done since then has been amazing, absolutely amazing. So they've turned their family tragedy into a campaign across the world or across the country to try and get people to understand what the issues are. And again, those are the sorts of people, I think, who can help us, not necessarily the medical community, but the lived experience, those that have gone through some of this stuff and understand what it's like to live it.
Right, thanks, Stephen. It's I do recommend the article, please, I think Stephen explains both the challenge and the victory, if you like, in achieving change by those parents in policy measures. And that's in the editorial and Frontiers in Science. Last word, please, if I could just ask each of those who haven't spoken in the last few minutes to give a last word. And Ed, I'm going to come straight to you because, of course, it builds off what Stephen just said. Communication, real life experience, real life experience is increasingly important in global health policy. I think WHO and various organizations would attest to that. Could you just bounce up that for us before we finish up?
Yeah, in a phrase, I often say that numbers numb, but stories sell. There's deep empirical research to back up that simplification. When the human mind processes story information in a very emotionally based way, and that is the way to get people to care. Tap into their emotions by telling a compelling story. Often telling, as Stephen has done, telling the compelling story of one person, one child, or in his case, 3 children and their families. That is absolutely the right way to help humanity, people, understand the larger point that the numbers are bringing to the fore. So Stephen's point is so important that although we advance understanding through research, which is inherently empirically based, that isn't necessarily the way to most effectively share what we know, which I'm going to use this probably as my closing thought, because I think it will be. The point of the perspective that I was offered the opportunity to contribute here was in my view, the single most important thing we can do is bring the era of fossil fuels to a close as rapidly as possible. It's the most important thing we can do for the health of everybody on the planet. So it eliminates that global North, global South divide that was addressed earlier in the conversation. It also helps to eliminate the divide between the wealthiest and the least wealthy in any given community on the planet. And the fundamental insight is that the health of people is intimately and inextricably linked to the health of our planet. So this is the one thing that we can do that will have the biggest impact, both for human health and planetary health, to rapidly bring the end of the fossil fuel era about.
Absolutely. And Kari, can I ask you to close the show, please? Last word from you. I'm afraid we are running out of time. So just having led this project, Kari, thanks again for bringing it to Frontiers in Science. And final word from yourself.
I just want to say thank you. I know we're out of time, and I just want to say thanks to Ed because his closing words, I think, meant everything to us. Thank you.
So we've finally reached the end of today's session. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd like to thank all the speakers, of course, for their time and their contribution today. That's Professor Kari Nadeau, Ioana Agache, John Balmes, Stephen Holgate, Ed Maibach, and Dr. John Balbus. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please, of course, visit the Frontiers in Science website to read the article that we've discussed today. and its hub of content, including the other articles we've talked about. You can continue the conversation on social media. As always, with Frontiers Forum is the hashtag. You can subscribe to our newsletter at the Frontiers in Science website. And for now, thank you to everyone. Thanks to yourself out there. Panel, please give everyone a wave, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.